Now, ladies and gentlemen, can we please have... oh, he's stomping his feet already. Hi, Kelly. All right, I'll do that. All right, ladies and gentlemen, please put your hands together for none other than the very dynamic, absolutely humorous, and all of us favorite, Kelly Snyder.
While they're pulling up my presentation, this all started back in February of 2020. It was a big trip I had here to India. I went all over the place. And towards the end of the trip, everyone started getting really nervous and telling me I had to come home. And I said, no, I have one more stop. I have to go see this. They were having some troubles, and the sample was up at a booster station that I had to get to. And it was also Holi that day. So there was a lot going on. Actually, the night before I went up to the site, the police came to my hotel and asked me every city I'd visited. And basically Raj said I needed to get on a plane and come home before they closed all the borders. But anyway, I did make it up there, and I got out of India apparently on the last day that it was possible. It was COVID, so that was the very beginning of it. Anyway, there is a phenomenon called microbial-induced corrosion. And I find that nobody wants to talk about this. It's almost a forbidden topic, because I think engineers don't like microbiology very much. I've learned from absolutely the best in the business. I've met almost the founders of slurry transport. I have talked to lots of people that have had 50 plus years designing slurry pipelines. And as soon as you ask anyone about this, silence. And some of these people like to talk, but they will not talk about this. But anyway, let's get started here. So this was what I went and saw that day in February. And I had a lot of trouble with it, because when I looked really closely at the failure mechanism, it was very clear that there had been a concentrated pitting attack, a corrosion attack along the heat-affected zone of the weld. And that's what caused this failure. And then this one was another failure of a similar mechanism, although the details were a little bit different. But clearly there had been localized corrosive attack on the welds. And these aren't the girth welds, these are the longitudinal welds from the pipe mill. And I couldn't provide a great explanation for this, and it made me pretty uncomfortable seeing that a pipe would fail this way. And shortly after this happened, there was a failure in Brazil that sounded very similar to this. And I asked them what they concluded was the root cause, and they gave some lame statement about the longitudinal weld from the factory wasn't very good. And I said, well, it passed hydro test and it's been in service for a number of years. Anyway, that just made me even more uncomfortable. So it's been about 5 years since I was alerted to this, and it's taken me a while to get to where I am now. But let's just start with what is corrosion. So generally, oxidative surface corrosion is there are some irregularities to it, but it's usually pretty uniform, and it's a chemical process, it's an electrochemical process where the base metal gradually turns into an oxide. In some cases you get a protective oxide or a semi-protective oxide, but it will eventually flake off. And then the next layer will start corroding, and then the next layer. And it's generally pretty uniform. Sometimes there can be concentrations of it, but it's not generally of the form we're seeing in the pipe failures for iron concentrates in India. So this over here is what we typically call pitting. And you see this a lot in stainless steels and aluminum, and it also happens to steel, because even though you don't think of an iron oxide as being a protective oxide, it does provide some protection. So if you have a layer of oxide of any type, on a stainless steel even, that's going to be protected, but if there's any damage to it, then you all of a sudden get accelerated corrosion underneath. And then eventually, if you grow a deep enough pit, this here will actually, well, it has an electrical effect, and so you get even faster corrosion, and so it's a very narrow pit. So we generally consider this, normally we call this pitting corrosion, and what I'm seeing in a lot of pipelines is something that looks very shallow. And then some of these other ones are typical of very high alloys or anyway, things like stainless steel that will fail like that, where as soon as you get damage to the surface, you can build up some concentration cells because they have so many different metals in the alloy. So this is usually kind of the corrosion 101 that a lot of people are aware of. But if you delve a little bit deeper into it, what you find is that especially in stagnant flows where there's not a lot of movement, I don't want to get into a whole bunch of details, I mean, for obvious reasons, but basically you get bacteria that can adhere to the surface of the pipe. And you don't really think of there being too many bacteria in the pipe, but that, well, one of the things that makes iron concentrate a little bit different from, say, copper concentrate is that it's a very benign material. If you go to a copper tailings pond, there are no plants growing in it. There are no alligators swimming around. But if you go to a iron tailings pond, it's just like a normal lake. So it's not a very toxic material. And so it is possible for these bacteria to start forming colonies, and there are nutrients in there. And some of these bacteria have very peculiar metabolisms so that they can actually basically survive in the pipe. And they form these colonies that you'll actually be able to see them if you're very careful about draining the water out of the pipe. You'll be able to actually see these colonizations in the pipe. Sometimes they get to be huge tubercles and like that. And this is actually a reality. I don't think anybody really likes the idea. It's kind of unpleasant to think of it that way. It's a lot easier to just think, oh, we're getting some oxygen attaching to the iron and the iron sort of flaking off. And that's a lot easier to predict, too. I can go and, if we're just talking about normal oxidative corrosion, I can test for that. Just give me a day and I can run it in a kettle and I can basically measure how the electrons are flowing and tell you how much corrosion you're going to get. But in this case, where there are life forms, it's a little bit harder to figure out. So it took me a while to realize that this is probably what's actually going on. And the other thing about these is that they are attracted to things like weld areas because the chemistry is a little bit different, and those areas also have a little bit different resistance to the kind of salt cells that these colonies cause. So just some examples. So I think all of these examples I'm about to show are from iron concentrate pipelines. But you can pretty much see this is very non-uniform, and the spalling that's taken place, you can see all these small, shallow cavities and how they grow into bigger cavities, which is pretty typical. It might be a little bit easier to see if we had some examples from early in the operation, but it also preferentially attacks on weld seams. Here's another one where you can just about make out these growths on here because it had I think a sulfide layer, but you can see how you've got this colonization inside the pipe. And you can definitely see how what we're still calling it pitting, but they're very shallow pits that are consistent with a microbiologically influenced corrosion. Here's another example. You can see the same pits, which are basically You can see them underneath that, the biological film that's formed there. And you can see the pits here that are also consistent with that. Here's another example. This is the same pipe, but with different lighting. You can also see that it's been colonized by these things. And like I say, this isn't a topic anyone really wants to talk about. Nobody wants to think of their pipeline as being infected with something. Here's another example. Obviously, we were more concerned with the bottom wear in this case, but again, you can see the same pattern forming. Oh yes, this is good. So everybody likes to talk about Savage River as being this pipeline that's lasted for 60 years. And in fact, it has lasted for 60 years, but that's because they figured out the solution to this. This is Savage River's pipe. Looks exactly like all these pipes that are failing in India after 20 years or 15 years. It looks exactly the same. Their problem is that they didn't have the pump capacity to overcome this. And so they didn't necessarily notice that the pipe was corroding, but they were extremely concerned about the increased roughness. And so they started trying to pig it to try to smooth it out, and that didn't really help that much. But they did eventually come up with a solution. And the solution, it turns out, was they just increased the pH. They just added more lime to it until it started to form a scale. Not that we particularly love scale, but they would allow it to scale, and then they would run this type of a pig through it. Not the kind of brush pig we normally see, but this is a polishing pig. And they would polish the inside of that surface that they created with the scale. And this is how they made it last 60 years. I don't think anybody's talking about this too much. So I just wanted to bring this to everyone's attention, since it's a little bit of a... some people are very skeptical that this is the actual mechanism, and that's fine, but at least we know what the solution is for these guys. My concern is that it's very difficult to predict how long your pipe is going to last if what we're talking about is microbes. They're difficult to predict. It's going to depend a lot on the kinds of growth like that. And so I think even though we haven't completely figured out what pH to set this to and what to do, I think long term we're going to be going in this direction. We're going to start increasing the lime dosages, and we're going to try to get back to having a smooth inside of the pipe by using a polishing type pig. And yeah, so it is fun for Raj because he doesn't know any of this. I just get up here and present stuff. He's like, what? So, I do want to add one more thing. I don't necessarily need all of my time, but I do want to add that this is definitely worse when your pipeline isn't flowing. And I think that might be part of the issue we're seeing with some of these problems here in India is with all the parking. But I think we can solve the issue. I think we're on the right track here. But I think some of these lines that have had failures, it was because they spent so long without any flow through them. Some of them had been shut down, for example. So that's really all I had to say about this topic. Like I say, I could have riffed for another 17 minutes, I guess, but we're a little behind. So I think I'll just stick with the meat of that presentation, and we still have to hear from Alan too. So, all right.